Good evening. It's my honor and privilege today to introduce Marianne Weaver. She is the foreign correspondent for The New Yorker and the author of her previous book in 1999, A Portrait of Egypt, A Journey Through the World of Militant Islam, and an Alicia Patterson Fellow for 2001. Her most recent book, Pakistan in the Shadow of Jihad in Afghanistan, has been called a seminal work on Pakistan, and it's a part of the world that really needs more coverage, and Miss Weaver's book is extremely educational in that regard. And I'd like to join you all in welcoming Miss Weaver to our store and maybe giving her the best welcome she's had. Thank you.
Thank you, Sammy. Thank you. All right, I will begin by reading from the book, and I have an acute case of the flu, so if I stumble or have a coughing fit, please forgive me. I will read rather shortly and allow all of you to ask questions subsequently. On September 11th, 2001, I was watching CNN when I learned of the unprecedented terror that visited the United States when 19 militant Islamists hijacked and crashed 4 commercial flights into the World Trade Center towers, the Pentagon, and a Pennsylvania field. Like everyone, I was stunned by the news, and my mind traveled back to Pakistan and to the US-financed jihad of the 1980s against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. Pakistan had been the key staging area for that war, a war of unintended consequence, as all of us who covered it and followed its aftermath knew. With the Soviet defeat in 1989, the CIA closed down its arms pipeline to the Afghan Mujahideen. Left behind were tens of thousands of well-trained and well-armed Arab, Asian, and Afghan fighters available for new jihads. Muhammad Atta, a 33-year-old Egyptian, was one of those men. Polite and well-educated, everyone now recalls, an unobtrusive man leading an unobtrusive life. A skilled pilot and engineer, he passed quietly a man in the shadows, in and out of Pakistan and Afghanistan during the jihad years. On August 28th, 2001, he booked a one-way ticket business class on an American Airlines flight from Boston to Los Angeles. At 7:45 on the morning of September 11th, flight number 11 took off. 1 hour and 3 minutes later, Muhammad Atta, who was at the controls, crashed it into the World Trade Center's North Tower, leaving behind a suicide note. Where did the United States go wrong? How do we deal with an invisible enemy? What do we do now? Sketching the outline of a new and aggressive American foreign policy, the Bush administration gave the nations of the world a stark choice: stand with us against terrorism and deny safe havens to terrorists, or face the certain prospect of destruction and death. The corridors of power in Washington resounded with the talk of war, and not unlike the earlier jihad in Afghanistan, no nation was more critical in the U.S. equation than Pakistan. For Pakistan had long supported, indeed it was the major lifeline to the Taliban, Afghanistan's ruling student militia, which had long embraced not only the terrorists who lived in the shadows, but also their mentors and financiers, including the United States' prime terrorist suspect, Osama bin Laden. Pakistan's support of U.S. military objectives was crucial to their success. At the time, there were simply no other bases on Afghanistan's borders that the United States could use, and access to Afghanistan, which is mountainous and landlocked, would have been exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, from anywhere else. But when Washington requested, then demanded, that its former ally permit the United States to use its country as a launching pad for military strikes against bin Laden, and a network of terrorist training camps inside Afghanistan, The ruling generals of Pakistan responded initially with equivocation at best. Although they pledged their full support, in the hunt for those responsible for September's outrage, they carefully avoided committing themselves to any active military role, and then to the fury of the United States, they pledged their continuing support to the Taliban. It was only after intense pressure from Washington, including the implied threat of an embargo on all financial aid and the ostracism of Pakistan as a pariah state, that the generals reluctantly agreed to provide the Pentagon with overflight rights, access to their ports and their bases, and as important as anything else, access to their intelligence on bin Laden's network and his whereabouts. But the generals insisted that any U.S. military presence on the ground be restricted to the most remote corners of Pakistan, the mountainous corridors of the northwest frontier province and the deserts of Baluchistan. Once among the loneliest outposts of the British Empire, these tribal lands have beguiled and fascinated, bewitched and repelled potential conquerors for thousands of years. I had first come to these Pakistani border regions nearly 20 years earlier to cover the jihad, a war that was never fully resolved. There had been no peace conference, no imperial carving of the spoils, and the war had thus continued in increasingly lethal form. It was a war of contradictions and confusions, a war fought in Kipling's world between independent peoples and independent tribes whose ancient codes of honor and animosities have coalesced to make this one of the most volatile, dangerous, yet fascinating places on earth. And the war's contradictions were in every sense mirrored here in the jihad staging area, Pakistan. Looking back on those early years, which for me began in 1982, I find it nearly impossible to recall anything about Pakistan that was predictable. I began to wonder whether anomalies weren't the rule. I visited immaculately groomed cricket fields where smart young men dressed in immaculate whites knelt on the ground facing Mecca for midday prayers. Then I drove only a few blocks away to a dung-colored soccer field where men in turbans and flowing pantaloons practiced the ancient art of buskasi, which is perhaps best described as American football, on horseback, with few rules. The ball, so to speak, is a headless calf. This is Peshawar, the dusty border town near the Khyber Pass, which served as the key staging area for the jihad of the 1980s in Afghanistan. Exquisite Islamic architecture exists side by side with teeming Afghan refugee camps and nomadic Pakistani tent societies. In the Tony neighborhood of University Town, well-appointed villas, including a number owned by Osama bin Laden, nestle concealed behind towering whitewashed walls. Every man seems to carry a weapon, and bandaloons festoon their chests, a testament perhaps to the world of the undefeated Pathans. The few women in evidence are shrouded in burqas, covered from head to toe. Anonymous forms, they glide in and out of storefront shops. I always found a constant stream of visiting clerics and mullahs, freedom fighters and spies roaming Peshawar's narrow lanes and calling one by one at the offices of the 7 major Afghan resistance groups, which, though they had been fighting one another for years, were still, in a manner of speaking, coordinating the war effort inside Afghanistan. Then, they fashioned themselves under the banner of the Central Alliance. They have since changed their name to the Northern Alliance. Today, 20 years later, they, like Pakistan itself, are once again fighting America's Afghanistan war. In the months preceding September 11th, 2001, When I traveled through Pakistan, the country's economic decline was unmistakable. There was also a tangible fear, which I had never perceived before, that Pakistan was drifting, perhaps inexorably, toward chaos. One of my most vivid impressions was of decay, of overcrowded cities and crumbling buildings seen through a patina of dust, of bands of children with dirty faces and outstretched hands enveloping me wherever I walked, of the breakdown of law and order as dark-haired, dark-eyed men moved through villages with AK-47s slung from their shoulders, swaying gently against their hips. Men with full-length Islamic beards now seemed common, and there were far more turbans of militant Islamic green. Madrasas, or Islamic religious schools, were everywhere now, or so it seemed to me, an estimated 40,000 of them, dotting the country in various shapes and forms, some with vast acreage and dormitories, others tiny makeshift rooms in mosques, in poor neighborhoods. But perhaps what struck me most was that in every city and town there are monuments to Pakistan's nuclear bomb. In Quetta, Peshawar, Karachi, and Lahore, towering replicas rise from central squares of the Chagai Hills, the site in the desert of Baluchistan, where Pakistan scientists and its generals tested their bomb in 1998, 2 weeks after India exploded its own. And in the capital of Islamabad, a futuristic granite-structured lofts by day and is illuminated by night in fiery hues of orange. As I stood before it one evening and puzzled over what it meant, a Pakistani friend explained that the interior lighting was meant to impart the glow of the nuclear weapon that had exploded in the Chagai Hills. The man who will determine Pakistan's future course, and in a sense, also the course of America's war against terror in and around Afghanistan, is the little-known, enigmatic general, Parvez Musharraf, the last in a line of military dictators who have ruled Pakistan for nearly 28 of its 55 independent years. It was September of 2000 when I first met the general in his hotel suite in New York, and I wasn't at all certain what to expect. He had been described to me as a chameleon, a man who can be anything. Thank you. The three sections of my book that I chose to read from were meant to kind of convey three of the more critical themes in my book. One is that no country on earth is more critical to U.S. geopolitical interests than Pakistan, but at what cost to it? So much of the chaos, so much of the anarchy in Pakistan today is a direct result of the American war in Afghanistan 2 decades ago. Pakistan is a drugs culture, it is an arms culture, it is a culture where militant Islam is on the rise. It is a country in which an act of terrorism occurs on average every other day. There's also, for people like myself who covered the first American war in Afghanistan, an extraordinary sense of déjà vu in Pakistan today. Not only are the same warlords and tribal chiefs whom we supported, funded, armed, and trained 20 years ago with such disastrous effect, now returned to power in Afghanistan, primarily by the United States. Of the 25,000 or so Islamic militants who streamed into Afghanistan during the jihad years from 50 countries around the world. Many are now returning home to the battlefields along the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. I also wanted to convey the sense of both danger, also of chaos and uncertainty which Pakistan faces today. Many pundits have said that Pakistan is experiencing institutional meltdown, and in a sense it is. Other pundits have said Pakistan could be the next Yugoslavia, splintering and fragmenting into 4 co-equal parts. But the big difference between Yugoslavia and Pakistan is that Pakistan has 30 to 50 nuclear bombs. And also I wanted to convey a sense of Parvez Musharraf, the present military ruler of Pakistan, a chameleon, a man who can be anything. Parvez Musharraf, as those of you who follow Pakistan know, held extraordinarily restricted and controversial elections last month. He had so manipulated the political process in advance of the elections, he had so marginalized the secular grassroots political parties in Pakistan that he created a vacuum in which the Islamic militants, for the first time in the history of Pakistan, won nearly 25% of the vote. 59 seats in a parliament of 272 elected representatives. In the last elections in 1997, the Islamists won 4 seats. So Musharraf, in a sense, has hoisted himself on his own petard. He has made the Islamists the kingmakers in the new government. Every day we wait for the bargaining and the bartering and the backroom deals to bear fruition. Twice the convening of Parliament has been suspended. It is now scheduled to take place this Saturday. We still have no idea who the main players will be. Will it be a coalition between Musharraf and the generals and the religious right? Will it be a coalition between the religious right and Benazir Bhutto, the next to last democratically elected Prime Minister of Pakistan, who is bargaining very, very hard? She's in exile abroad. She was prevented from standing in the elections. She has some very, very strong conditions that Musharraf may or may not agree to. Or thirdly, will we see a broad-based unity government? Probably very unlikely. So in any scenario, the Islamist parties will be the kingmakers, not only at the center, but as importantly, they control the provincial governments in both the Northwest Frontier Province and Baluchistan, Pakistan's 2 most sensitive and strategic provinces, Pakistan's 2 provinces that border Afghanistan, the 2 provinces through which, according to Pakistani intelligence officials, some 5,000 members of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda passed during the late winter and early spring of this year, perhaps including Osama bin Laden himself. You now have a situation where the Islamists will be the kingmakers, a situation where anti-Americanism is inflamed, anti-Americanism is growing, and the result of these elections and the result of continuing military rule and the commensurate instability it is causing in Pakistan bode very ill for the future success of Washington's war against terror. Thank you.
If
It is. It's frightening.
I had heard before that they keep changing the Constitution to do what they please.
One of the things that Musharraf did, well, the two most egregious things that he did in the minds of democratically inclined people before these parliamentary elections was that in April he held a referendum which extended his self-proclaimed presidency by 5 years. He then subsequently, as every single military leader in Pakistan has done, amended the Constitution. He promulgated, by decree, 29 amendments, which in fact give him the power to dismiss at will the parliament that will be sworn in on Saturday, and as importantly as anything else, establishes a National Security Council, which gives the military a predominant role in Pakistani affairs.
Should the U.S. government react to this, and how should they deal with Musharraf, in as much as we apparently made him our ally in this war on terrorism?
Well, the U.S. government has turned a blind eye to a large number of human rights abuses of the Musharraf regime. It gave its tacit support to Musharraf's holding of his referendum, a referendum, incidentally, in which no opposition candidates were permitted to stand, a referendum in which Pakistanis were given the choice of voting yes or no to a question that no would have been, if not unpatriotic, totally unthinkable. This was done with the tacit approval of the United States. These parliamentary elections, again, with the tacit approval of the United States. And I think we've got, maybe this is naive, but I think we should start to preach what we practice and practice what we preach. We talk about regime change in Iraq. What about regime change in all of the military dictatorships throughout the Middle East, plus in Pakistan? We have written off $1 billion in external debt for Musharraf. We have lifted sanctions on military and economic aid. We should have some leverage because Musharraf has been a very, very dichotomous ally from the very beginning. He is a man on a tightrope. He has never fully supported our war on terrorism. Yes, fine, of the 600 prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, about half were apprehended in Pakistan, but 5,000 others slipped through. They are now leaving the tribal areas. They are infiltrating into Pakistan's major cities. This would not be possible without the support of, number one, the Islamists, and number two, the Pakistani military intelligence organization, ISI. Yes.
Marianne Weaver, I've read your book and I really enjoyed reading it.
Thank you.
It's quite a fascinating description of the people and the society and the landscape of Pakistan, which is very evocative.
Well, thank you very much.
By the way, I've written a review of your book for Dawn, which would be appearing in the 24th. They have a Sunday edition called Books and Authors, and I did receive a copy from the publisher. And I've already sent the review, but it will appear on the 24th.
Thank you very much.
Now, one of the most interesting things in your book is the comparison between Musharraf and Zia. And you quote Musharraf very unequivocally separates himself from Zia, saying that, that man was more obsessed with religion, I am a secular guy. And he makes 2 or 3, delineations that he was there forever, and I don't plan to be a president for life and things like that. But then, in a very devastating analysis, you show how both of them are the chips of the same block. I really enjoyed that part, where you brought them. I mean, it's basically the military bureaucracy or the military rule of Pakistan, which has been also the cause of many problems. Anyway, my question is that I believe you subscribe to what is known as blowback, the CIA term for unintended
I do.
consequences. I think you wrote an article in 1996 in New Yorker, which I
It
did.
was actually the Atlantic Monthly,
Was it? I
Yeah.
see. I see.
and it was 96.
But as you know, Chalmers Johnson has written a complete book on the subject of blowback, where American foreign policy created problems which then have a kind of retributory effect on the United States. The 9/11 attack being the biggest of them all. But while reading through your book, at the end, you've sort of analyzed Osama bin Laden. You said that he was, and I'm reading here, he was politicized by the jihad of the 80s, and that he was radicalized by the Gulf War, meaning that by when the U.S. put its troops in Saudi Arabia, I think that's one of his problems, or he highlights those as one of the big problems. And finally, you said the Intifada gave him a cause. And then you go on to say that, had not these things not happened, he probably would still be an entrepreneur, turning his 80 million into a billion or whatever. But if you subscribe to blowback, don't you think somebody else would have come into the picture and done the same thing?
Well, I'm not sure someone would have come in with $250 million, an extraordinary gift for entrepreneurial enterprises. I think that Osama bin Laden is unique in that he brings together the traditions of Wahhabism, Western education, a zeal that is all-encompassing and all-enveloping vis-a-vis being able to bring together very disparate movements from very, very different Islamic countries. I mean, I think Osama the man, when I said, had there been no jihad, Osama probably would be sitting in Jeddah right now, parlaying a fortune of $80 million, which he inherited at the age of 13, and even more money than he has now, because Osama was absolutely apolitical before he first arrived in Peshawar in 1981. He then moved to Peshawar in 84. The jihad increasingly politicalized him, radicalized him. It was in Peshawar that he first met people like Ayman al-Zawahiri, who became, in a sense, an ideological guru to Osama. So I'm not sure, yes, had there been no jihad, I think you would have continued to have seen Islamist movements gaining strength during the 80s and the 90s. Because in many instances, Egypt, for example, their complaints are quite legitimate. There are a lot of complaints of Hamas and Islamic Jihad, which are very legitimate. But what the jihad did was that it brought all of these very different groups together in Peshawar and in Afghanistan, almost created a Moscow Central for these groups. I mean, how would a Moro have ever met an Algerian, or a Moroccan met someone from Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines? And I mean, these guys came together, they bonded, they networked, and they stayed in touch. And that is the blowback syndrome that we are seeing today.
So that is why now that we talk about that Osama bin Laden has terrorist network in 40 different countries. In other words, it was in the jihad in Afghanistan that
they all came together.
They came together, and now they've gone back to those countries.
Musharraf has, I gather, virtually no base whatever in the politics of the country. He has no following. He's a man without a party, without the wherewithal to run as a democratic leader. what about in the armed forces and the intelligence services? What kind of a base does he have there? I haven't read the book yet, and I assume you're into it, but...
Okay, let me first say yes, Musharraf is a man without a constituency outside the Army. And I think this is one of the major miscalculations that Musharraf made from the very beginning, because Musharraf, like Zia al-Haq, the previous military dictator, is absolutely disdainful of politicians. But at least Zia tried to entice, cajole, collaborate with certain hand-picked groups of politicians. Musharraf hasn't. Musharraf has been totally disdainful of the entire political apparatus in Pakistan. Therefore, his support, yes, is limited to the army. The corps commanders, of whom there are 9, really wield the power in Pakistan. Of the corps commanders, they're practically split 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. 1/3 secular, 1/3 hardline Islamist, 1/3 fence sitting. Musharraf has the support of the 3 secularists, and for the moment, at least the tentative guarded support of the 3 fence sitters. His relationship with ISI is much more difficult to fathom. He has purged the leadership of ISI. He did so in October, shortly after committing himself to the United States. But he only purged the leadership, basically 3 men. And it was more, in my view, a means of consolidating his own power than it was to rid the ISI of Islamists. But when you look at the brigadiers and even the major generals in the ISI today, these are the same people who were majors and captains at the time of the first war in Afghanistan. They are much more fundamentalist than Musharraf. Musharraf is not fundamentalist, let me make that clear. Musharraf is a secularist, but he has consistently backed down to the fundamentalists from the day he seized power in October of 1999, consistently. So he's got a lot of checks and balances that he's dealing with. He really is a man alone and a man on a tightrope. And Indian intelligence is of the opinion that Musharraf probably would have been overthrown by now had it not been for the American presence in and commitment to Pakistan.
Question. You mentioned earlier in terms of U.S. policy, practicing what they preach in terms of democratization and all that, and instead of supporting a unelected hardline military ruler. But and this question also, I guess, would apply to U.S. policy in general in the Middle East. How do you, if you move toward a more democratic route, how do you then deal with the issues such as fundamentalism, meaning having a fundamentalist government being elected, which could obviously create a lot of instability on the one hand, or returning to a situation like you had with Sharif, where there was rampant corruption and certain actions were taken, such as trying to down Musharraf's plane. Those kind of issues in terms of how do you, what kind of policy should the United States pursue in that area in terms of trying to maybe foment a democratic Pakistan, but at the same time avoiding these issues in terms of corruption on the one hand and also militant fundamentalism on the other?
Okay, let me answer that in 2 parts. First of all, I think that the United States government made a very grave error in allowing Musharraf to marginalize and neutralize the political forces in Pakistan to the extent that he has. Because this, in turn, as I said, led to the very vacuum that created the extraordinary showing for the fundamentalists in these elections. Secondly, and let me speak more generally to the idea of fundamentalism, because Pakistan is slightly different from other Islamic countries that I know and I've covered. I mean, I don't think it's such a bad idea to allow fundamentalists into the political arena. In the 1980s in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood, under the Labour Party label, since they have been banned in Egypt since the 1950s, they emerged as the second largest party in parliamentary elections. They led the parliamentary opposition, and they did it very well. They did it very moderately. They did it very responsibly. They instituted a number of social programs, economic programs, programs for women. Same thing in Turkey, when the first Islamist government came to power in Turkey, before it was ousted by the military. Jordan, they're playing a very constructive role. Now in Pakistan, it's slightly different because Islam in Pakistan is more of, largely because of the madrasas, the Islamic religious schools, it's more of a kind of doctrinaire Wahhabism, Deobandism merging together. And unlike the movements in Palestine, in Jordan, in Egypt, where you really have a profusion of academics, intellectuals, lawyers, doctors, people to the manner born. In Pakistan, yes, you have these people, but you also have the mullanas who have come out of the madrasas. But I know for a fact, I mean, everyone is quite frightened at the prospect of the Maulana Fazli Rahman, who heads the six-party religious alliance, becoming the Prime Minister of Pakistan. And the Maulana Fazli Rahman is a pretty frightening person. He is someone who has variously been supported by Libya, Saudi Arabia, and Iran over the years. He is the person that, according to a spokesman for the Afghan Defense Ministry, personally escorted Osama bin Laden from the Afghan border into the northwest frontier province of Pakistan when he fled the American campaign in Tora Bora. But that being said, the Maulana Fazli Rahman, who is someone that I've known since the 1980s, he is a very political creature. He is much more political than he is religious. He wants a piece of the pie. So let's see what he does. I mean, he is clamoring now for the Americans to leave Pakistan immediately, but he no longer makes such a statement to Dawn. Then 5 minutes later, when his deputy says, well, the Maulana really, I mean, fine, the Americans must leave, but they can do it slowly. So, I mean, I think that, you know, there is a way in which moderate Islamists and secularists can come together, even in Pakistan, and marginalize the militants.
Any further questions?
I'm sure it's outside the scope of this, but I just was hearing lately that the Russians may not have done too badly in some areas when they went into Pakistan. Am I completely wrong?
When they went into Afghanistan?
I mean, into Afghanistan.
Oh, absolutely. They did wonderful things for women, for education. I mean, they were brutal, obviously, but Afghan women prospered under the Soviet occupation. Women entered the professions as they never had before, entered universities. I mean, everything that the Taliban subsequently did was the exact juxtaposition of what the Soviets had done earlier.
Could I ask a sort of an overall question? Although it's hypothetical, I mean, you can never, in hindsight, you can say these things. Had Ronald Reagan not pursued the first Afghan war, hypothetically speaking, you would not have had the problems that you have in Pakistan. You yourself detailed them, the drug culture and the weapons culture, I think, was an offshoot of what happened in the 80s. Before that, Karachi was a totally different city, for example. What happened to Karachi was a net result of the first Afghan war. And similarly, as some other people have pointed out, that Osama bin Laden was Frankenstein's monster, created because of, as you rightly pointed out, that had he not come there, he would now be a very nice entrepreneur somewhere in California. So would you say that in hindsight, if that thing had not been pursued, we would not be facing what we are facing today?
I'm not saying that President Reagan should not have stood up to the Soviets. What I am saying, however, is that the way in which we did it was the wrong way. There was no accountability in this war. It was run by Pakistani intelligence, as you know, as well as I do. It was the ISI that decided which groups would receive the arms. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who is one of the scariest people I have ever met in 20 years as a journalist, who is viscerally anti-American, who throws acid at women who will not veil in his presence. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar received 50% of the CIA's arms. And Gulbuddin Hekmatyar is still on the scene in Afghanistan. He is a spoiler. So we supported the wrong people, the wrong way, through the wrong apparatus.
I think that's an excellent distinction.
Thank you.
What is Benazir Bhutto's future, if any, in Pakistan?
Well, Benazir has been out of the country for 3 years now. She was, as I said earlier, prohibited from standing in the elections. She was convicted in 1999 of corruption. She faces additional corruption charges in Pakistan. Musharraf has said over and over and over again, the moment this woman returns, she will be arrested. Musharraf loathes Benazir. And I also think he's quite honestly terrified of her. Now, Benazir's party has the second largest number of seats in parliament. She could form a coalition with the Maulana Fazli Rahman or with Musharraf if he will meet her terms. It seemed 2 weeks ago that in fact it was going to be a Musharraf-Benazir government. And both Musharraf's people and Benazir's people were leaking that the prime minister would be a PPP, a Benazir candidate. Benazir would be permitted to return to Pakistan 3 months after her prime minister was sworn in. Her husband, Asif Ali Zardari, who has been in prison for 6 years, would be released. And the final touch would be that Benazir would receive a triumphant return home, welcomed at the airport by General Pervez Musharraf and her released husband. Then this fell apart. They are still talking. Her husband was to have had a bail hearing yesterday. Everyone reading the tea leaves in Pakistan said, well, if Asif is released on medical grounds and flown out of the country, that is the harbinger. It means Benazir got her wish. Benazir will form a government with Musharraf. But Sami told me before we began this evening that Asif's mother died yesterday, and the bail hearing presumably did not take place. But I mean, she has potential. And, you know, Benazir, she is willing now to cooperate with anyone to be returned to power, whether it is Pervez Musharraf, who was, ironically, Pervez Musharraf was Benazir Bhutto's director of military operations during her second prime ministership. It was Benazir Bhutto and her Minister of the Interior who spawned, for all intents and purposes, the Taliban. Benazir, the secular, Harvard-educated, Oxford-educated, Western feminist, helped create the Taliban. And who was her director of military operations? Parvez Musharraf. And Benazir, during her second term, also collaborated with the religious right, the Maulana Fazli Rahman. He was the chairman of the Parliamentary Committee on Foreign Affairs. So again, it's kind of deja vu all over again. You now have the confluence of Benazir and Musharraf and the Maulana Fazli Rahman. And I'm sure General Nasrullah Barber will come out of retirement once again. So you kind of have the puppeteers of the Taliban all now trading and coalescing, and two of the three will form a government on Saturday. Any more questions?
If there are no more questions, would you like to sign now? Just sign signatures of people? Yeah. Mr. Walker wouldn't mind if you'll bring your books up, if you have them on you right now, and she'd sign them and autograph them for you. If you don't have any on you right now and you'd like to buy some, we have a whole pile back there right in front of the door of her book on Pakistan, and you can go pick it up, get it signed, and then purchase it at the counter. And thank you for coming.
Thank you.